Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests, Shepherd's Hollow was a place where time seemed to stand still. The town had only one main road, lined with modest homes, a general store, and the steepled church that served as its heart. Elijah grew up here, the son of devout Christians whose lives revolved around faith and community. For as long as he could remember, Sundays were for church, evenings for prayer, and every decision weighed against the teachings of the Bible. As the youngest of 3 children, Elijah often felt the pressure to follow in his siblings' footsteps. His older brother, David, was a deacon in the church, and his sister, Miriam, ran the choir. Their parents expected Elijah to embrace the same pious path, but he often found himself staring out the window during sermons, imagining a life beyond the narrow confines of Shepherd's Hollow. "God has a plan for you," his mother would often say, her voice filled with hope. But Elijah wasn't so sure. By the time Elijah turned 16, his restlessness had grown into rebellion. He began sneaking out at night to meet friends by the river, where they'd drink stolen beer and talk about leaving town. The first time he skipped church, he felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the thrill of freedom. His parents noticed the change, their once cheerful son now distant and defiant. Elijah's mother, Sarah, was a woman of unshakable faith. She prayed for her son every night, often with tears streaming down her face. One evening, after Elijah came home late smelling of alcohol, Sarah confronted him. "Why are you doing this to us?" "To yourself?" she asked, her voice breaking. Elijah couldn't meet her eyes. "I just need to figure out who I am," he mumbled, but the words offered little comfort. Everything changed one fateful evening. Elijah returned home to find his mother sitting in the living room, clutching a letter from his school. He'd been caught cheating on an exam, and the principal had written to inform his parents. "Elijah," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "I don't know how much more of this I can take." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The sight of his mother so broken shattered something in Elijah. That night, he lay awake, haunted by her words. The next Sunday, Elijah surprised his parents by getting dressed for church without being asked. Though his heart wasn't fully in it, he sat through the service, listening intently to Pastor Samuel's sermon about redemption. It felt as though the words were meant for him. Afterward, his parents hugged him tightly, their relief palpable. Over the weeks that followed, Elijah began attending church regularly. He joined Bible study groups and volunteered for community projects. Slowly, he found himself drawn to the idea of helping others find their way, just as he was trying to find his own. His parents, especially his mother, were overjoyed. "I always knew you'd come back to God," Sarah said, her eyes shining with pride. One afternoon, while helping Pastor Samuel repair the church's roof, Elijah confessed his newfound sense of purpose. "I think I want to become a pastor," he said hesitantly. Pastor Samuel paused, looking at Elijah thoughtfully. "It's not an easy path," he said, "but if you feel called, it's the most rewarding work there is." Encouraged, Elijah began studying scripture more intensely, preparing himself for the journey ahead. After years of training under Pastor Samuel, Elijah finally opened his own small church. It was a modest building at the edge of town, with peeling paint and mismatched pews. But to Elijah, it was a symbol of hope. His first sermon was heartfelt, though only a handful of people attended. "It's a start," he told himself, determined to make a difference. Despite his passion, Elijah's church struggled to grow. Many townsfolk preferred Pastor Samuel's larger, more established congregation. Elijah's sermons, though sincere, lacked the flair that drew crowds. Discouraged but not defeated, he spent long nights praying for guidance, wondering if he was truly fulfilling God's plan. One late evening, as Elijah locked up the church after another sparsely attended service, he noticed an old man sitting in the last pew. The man, dressed in a tattered coat, introduced himself as Mr. Grayson. "Your words have potential, young man," the old man said with a gravelly voice. "But potential is nothing without power." Elijah, intrigued yet cautious, listened as Mr. Grayson spoke of ways to reach the hearts of people, ways that required more than just sermons. Mr. Grayson's words lingered in Elijah's mind. Though he dismissed them at first, his growing frustration with the empty pews made him question his methods. Was he too focused on humility? Did people crave something more tangible, more miraculous? He began to notice how Pastor Samuel's church thrived, often attributing their success to their reputation for miraculous healings. Elijah spent sleepless nights wrestling with his doubts. He prayed fervently for guidance, asking God to show him the path forward. Yet, the silence he perceived in response only deepened his despair. One evening, he found himself back in the empty church, staring at the altar. "Am I not enough, Lord?" he whispered. Mr. Grayson appeared again, this time outside Elijah's church as he prepared to leave for the night. "You're struggling, aren't you?" the old man said. Elijah, weary and desperate, didn't deny it. "What if I told you there's a way to bring people here, to make them believe in your message?" Grayson's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. Elijah hesitated but agreed to hear him out. Grayson spoke of ancient rituals, sacrifices, and the promise of power, the ability to perform miracles that would draw people in droves. Elijah was horrified but couldn't deny the allure of what Grayson described. "Think about it," Grayson said before disappearing into the night. "You could save souls in ways you never imagined." For days, Elijah wrestled with the implications of Grayson's offer. The very thought of engaging in something so dark made him feel sick, yet the image of his empty church haunted him. He confided in no one, fearing judgment and shame. On a stormy night, Elijah fell to his knees in the church, crying out to God for guidance. "Show me a sign, Lord. Please show me what to do." The thunder outside drowned out his cries, leaving him in the deafening silence of his own thoughts. It was then that he began to question whether divine intervention would ever come. Unable to bear the emptiness of his church any longer, Elijah found himself seeking out Grayson. They met in a secluded part of the forest, where the old man reiterated the terms of the pact. "Sacrifice brings power," he said. "The more it costs, the greater the reward." Elijah's hands trembled as he considered the implications. Grayson's words echoed in Elijah's mind as he returned home to find his mother praying in the living room. Her unwavering faith had always been a source of comfort, yet now it felt like a burden. The thought of sacrificing someone so dear twisted his stomach, but Grayson's promise of success gnawed at him. In the dead of night, Elijah made his choice. The ritual was dark and horrifying, and as he completed it, he felt an otherworldly surge of power coursing through him. The next Sunday, his church was filled to capacity, the news of miraculous healings spreading like wildfire. But the cost weighed heavily on his soul, a burden he could never share. Elijah's church became the talk of Shepherd's Hollow. People traveled from nearby towns to witness the miraculous healings and powerful sermons. The once empty pews were now overflowing, and Elijah found himself basking in the adoration of his congregation. Yet, deep down, he felt the weight of a secret, a dark shadow lurking beneath the surface of his newfound success. Amid the growing crowd, one woman stood out. Grace was a newcomer to Shepherd's Hollow, her kind eyes and quiet demeanor capturing Elijah's attention. She attended every service, often staying behind to help with chores around the church. Her presence brought a lightness to Elijah's heavy heart, and he found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. Elijah and Grace began spending more time together, their conversations ranging from faith to their hopes for the future. Grace admired Elijah's dedication to his ministry, unaware of the dark secret he carried. For the first time in months, Elijah felt a flicker of genuine happiness, though the guilt of his actions never truly left him. As the church's popularity continued to grow, the demands of maintaining his miraculous powers weighed heavily on Elijah. Grayson appeared once more, reminding him of the pact. "The power requires sustenance," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. This time, Elijah's hesitation was shorter, his desperation overriding his morality. The second sacrifice was made, further entangling Elijah in the dark web of his choices. Grace had always admired Elijah for his passion and dedication. His sermons, now filled with powerful messages and miraculous healings, were the talk of the town. Yet, at home, Elijah seemed distant. Nights passed without conversation, and Grace often found him locked in his study, poring over texts she couldn't recognize. She told herself he was simply committed to his work, but the doubts lingered. "Elijah," she asked one evening, her voice soft yet probing, "are you happy? You've achieved so much, but you seem burdened." He looked up from his desk, his eyes hollow. "I'm doing what I've been called to do, Grace. That's all that matters." But his words lacked conviction, and Grace's worry deepened. One night, as the wind howled through the trees, Elijah was startled by a knock at the church door. He opened it to find Mr. Grayson standing there, his piercing eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I see your church is thriving," the old man said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "But you know the cost, don't you?" Elijah's stomach churned. "I've done what you asked. Isn't that enough?" Grayson's smile faded. "Power demands sacrifice. The bigger your following, the greater the price. Have you forgotten?" Elijah clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. But he knew Grayson was right. The church's recent growth would not come without its consequences. Word of Elijah's miracles spread beyond Shepherd's Hollow. Pilgrims traveled from neighboring towns, seeking healing and solace. The pews were always full, the collection plates overflowing. But with every success, Elijah felt a deeper void inside him. The miracles, though spectacular, felt hollow, a grotesque parody of faith. Grace began to notice subtle changes in Elijah. His sermons grew darker, more focused on obedience and sacrifice. She tried to confront him, but he deflected her questions with vague reassurances. Late one night, as Elijah sat alone in the church, Grayson appeared once more. "It's time for the next offering," he said, his voice as cold as the grave. Elijah's heart sank. I won't do this anymore." Grayson's expression hardened. "You made a pact, Elijah. Break it, and you'll lose everything. Your power, your church, your life." Elijah's mind raced. He had already sacrificed so much. Could he bear to lose it all? The next morning, Elijah visited his father, who had grown frail with age, but remained sharp in spirit. Over tea, his father spoke of the dangers of ambition. "Son, faith is about trust in God, not the works of men. Beware the paths that promise power. They rarely lead to righteousness." Elijah nodded, but guilt gnawed at him. His father's words were a painful reminder of the man he used to be. While cleaning Elijah's study, Grace stumbled upon a hidden drawer filled with strange symbols and notes about rituals. Her hands trembled as she pieced together the fragments of Elijah's dark secret. That night, she confronted him, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Elijah, what have you done?" He tried to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. Grace's trust was shattered, and for the first time, Elijah saw the true cost of his choices. The days following Grace's discovery were suffocatingly tense. She moved through the house in silence, her gaze sharp and questioning. Elijah tried to focus on his sermons, but the weight of her suspicion was unbearable. One evening, Grace sat across from him at the dining table. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Elijah, I need to know everything. No lies. No evasion. What have you done to us?" Elijah looked down at his hands, his voice barely audible. "I wanted to save the church. To save us. I made a mistake, Grace. A terrible one." "Mistake?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You've built this life on lies and darkness. How could you think this was right?" Tears filled Elijah's eyes, but he had no answers to give. He could only watch as Grace stood and walked away, her faith in him shattered. Despite his personal turmoil, Elijah's church continued to grow. The miracles had solidified his reputation as a man of God. People flocked to him, desperate for healing and hope. Yet, as he stood before them each Sunday, he felt like a fraud. The power that had once exhilarated him now felt like a chain around his soul. He saw the faces of the desperate, the hopeful, and the lost, and he wondered how much longer he could continue this charade. One day, after a particularly emotional sermon, a young woman approached him. She held a baby in her arms, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Pastor Elijah. You saved my son. Without your prayers, he wouldn't be here today." Elijah forced a smile, but her gratitude only deepened his guilt. Late one night, as Elijah paced the church, Grayson appeared once more. This time, his presence felt heavier, more menacing. "You've delayed long enough," Grayson said, his tone icy. "The power you wield requires maintenance. A greater sacrifice is due." Elijah's heart pounded. "I can't do this anymore. I've already given too much." Grayson stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice. The power you covet is not free. Refuse, and everything you've built will crumble." Elijah stared at the old man, his mind racing. The walls of his sanctuary seemed to close in around him. He had reached a point of no return, and the choices before him were darker than ever. Elijah spent the following days in restless turmoil. He combed through the scriptures, searching for answers, for loopholes, for anything that might free him from Grayson's grip. The words of his father echoed in his mind. Faith is about trust in God, not the works of men. But trust felt so distant now. The divine presence that once guided him seemed obscured by the shadow of his choices. He knelt in the sanctuary late one night, tears streaming down his face. "God, if you're still there, show me the way. Help me undo this." His prayer was met with silence, but a small flicker of determination ignited within him. Perhaps redemption wouldn't come from divine intervention, but from his own willingness to face the truth. Grace had been staying with her sister since their confrontation, but she returned home one evening, a resolute look on her face. "Elijah, I'm not here to argue," she began, her tone firm but calm. "I need to know if there's still a man of faith in you, because the man I see now, I don't recognize him." Elijah's throat tightened. "I've made mistakes, Grace, but everything I did was for us, for the church." "Then prove it," she said, her eyes unwavering. "Prove it by making it right. If you can't, I can't stay." Her words struck him like a blow. Grace was his anchor, his one remaining link to the life he had once cherished. He knew he couldn't afford to lose her, or himself, any further. Grayson laid out the terms. The next sacrifice would require a part of Elijah's humanity, his ability to experience intimacy, joy, and connection. "It's the ultimate test of devotion," Grayson explained. "Prove your commitment, and your power will surpass anything you've known." Tears streamed down Elijah's face as he realized the gravity of what was being asked. Yet, in his desperation, he agreed. The ritual was carried out in the dead of night, leaving Elijah a hollow shell of the man he once was. His sermons grew more impassioned, his miracles more astonishing, but the cost was unbearable. Grace sensed the change immediately. Their already strained relationship became even colder. She tried to reach out, but Elijah withdrew further, consumed by the darkness of his choices. The congregation, unaware of the sacrifices behind Elijah's miracles, continued to revere him. They spoke of his divine touch, his ability to heal the sick and mend broken hearts. But Elijah could no longer find solace in their praise. One Sunday, as he stood before the packed pews, he felt a wave of nausea. The faces of the faithful blurred, their adoration a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. For the first time, he faltered in a sermon, his voice trembling with guilt. After the service, Grace confronted him. "Elijah, you're not well. Please, let me help you." But Elijah turned away, unable to face the woman who still loved him despite everything. Grace could no longer ignore the growing chasm between them. One evening, she sat Elijah down, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "I can't do this anymore, Elijah. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you've done, it's tearing us apart." Elijah's heart ached, but he remained silent. "I need the truth," she continued. "If you can't give me that, I don't know how we can move forward." Elijah stared at her, his mind racing. Could he confess? Could he risk losing her completely? Grace's voice softened. "I love you, Elijah. But I can't keep fighting for someone who won't fight for us." As she walked away, Elijah was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of his choices crushing him. The days following Grace's ultimatum were some of the darkest in Elijah's life. The walls of his home felt suffocating, the silence between him and Grace deafening. He spent more time at the church, pouring his energy into sermons and miracles, hoping to drown out his guilt. One night, as he sat alone in his study, Elijah opened the drawer where he kept the ritual texts and symbols. The weight of what he had done stared back at him. The sacrifices, the lies, the lives destroyed for the sake of power. It was all too much. For the first time in months, he knelt in genuine prayer. "Lord, if you can hear me, show me a way out. I've strayed so far. Please help me find my way back." But the only response was the echo of his own voice. Grace, determined to uncover the truth, began her own quiet investigations. She visited members of the congregation, asking subtle questions about Elijah's miracles and the origins of his power. While most people praised Elijah, a few older members mentioned strange occurrences, a shadowy figure seen near the church, odd noises late at night. Her search led her to the town archives, where she discovered records of a man named Grayson. He had been a preacher in Shepherd's Hollow over a century ago, but was accused of practicing dark rituals. The parallels between Grayson's story and Elijah's behavior were chilling. Armed with this knowledge, Grace confronted Elijah one evening. "Who is Grayson?" she demanded, holding the records in her trembling hands. "And what does he have to do with you?" Elijah's face went pale. He had no words, only silence. Unrest began to stir within the church. Whispers of doubt and suspicion spread among the congregation. Some claimed to have seen Elijah speaking to a strange old man. Others questioned the true source of his miracles. The once united church began to fracture, with some members fiercely defending Elijah and others demanding answers. During a Sunday service, a group of elders confronted Elijah in front of the congregation. "Pastor," one of them said, his voice steady but firm, "we need transparency. Where does your power come from?" Elijah hesitated, the weight of their gazes heavy on him. "It comes from God," he said, but even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Late that night, Grayson appeared in Elijah's office. This time, his presence was more menacing than ever. "They're turning on you," he said, his voice a sinister whisper. "You'll lose everything unless you make the ultimate sacrifice." Elijah's blood ran cold. "What more could you possibly take from me?" Grayson's smile was cruel. "Your soul." Elijah recoiled, the magnitude of the demand sending waves of fear through him. "I can't. I won't." Grayson stepped closer, his eyes glowing with malevolence. "Then prepare to lose everything you hold dear." As the tension in the church reached a breaking point, Grace made one last attempt to reach Elijah. She found him in the sanctuary, staring at the cross with hollow eyes. "Elijah," she said softly, her voice breaking, "whatever you've done, whatever you're facing, you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you." Tears filled Elijah's eyes as he turned to her. "I've gone too far, Grace. There's no turning back now." "There's always a way back," she insisted, taking his hands in hers. "You just have to trust me." For the first time in years, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. But he also knew that trusting Grace would mean revealing everything. That evening, Elijah finally confessed. He told Grace about Grayson, the rituals, the sacrifices, and the source of his power. He expected her to recoil in horror, to leave him immediately. Instead, she sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. "You've done terrible things," she said at last, her voice trembling. "But if you truly want redemption, we'll find a way. Together." Elijah's heart ached with both relief and guilt. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "It's not about what you deserve," she said. "It's about what's right." Determined to free himself from Grayson's hold, Elijah and Grace researched ways to break the pact. They consulted old texts, spoke with religious scholars, and prayed tirelessly. Their efforts led them to a single, dangerous solution: ritual of severance that could banish Grayson but at great personal risk to Elijah. As they prepared for the ritual, Elijah felt a mix of fear and hope. He knew the process could kill him, but it was a risk he was willing to take to atone for his sins. The night of the ritual was stormy, the church illuminated by flickering candlelight. Grace stood by Elijah's side as he began the incantations. The air grew heavy, and shadows danced along the walls. Grayson appeared, his form more monstrous than ever. "You think you can escape me?" he snarled. "You are mine." Elijah stood his ground, reciting the final words of the ritual. A blinding light filled the church, and Grayson let out a scream of rage as he was pulled into the abyss. When the light faded, Elijah collapsed, his body weak but his spirit finally free. Elijah awoke in a hospital bed, Grace sitting by his side. "You did it," she said, her smile filled with both relief and pride. "You're free." Tears filled Elijah's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt peace. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." The road to redemption would be long, but Elijah was ready to walk it, with Grace by his side. The church, once a symbol of darkness and deceit, became a place of healing and truth. Elijah confessed his sins to the congregation, many of whom forgave him and chose to stay. Those who left did so without malice, their faith in God intact. Elijah's sermons took on a new tone, focusing on humility, forgiveness, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. He no longer performed miracles, but instead relied on the power of genuine faith. Grace became a pillar of the community, her unwavering faith inspiring others. She and Elijah worked together to rebuild not just the church, but their relationship. Their love, though tested, emerged stronger than ever. One evening, as they watched the sunset, Grace took Elijah's hand. "We've been through so much, but I believe we were meant to survive this, to help others find their way." Elijah nodded, a sense of purpose filling him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grace. You're my guiding light." Years later, Elijah reflected on his journey. The scars of his past remained, but they were a reminder of the lessons he had learned. Faith, he realized, was not about power or recognition, but about trust, humility, and love. Standing at the pulpit, he addressed his congregation. "Faith is not without cost, but the greatest faith is that which seeks not to gain, but to give. Let's walk this path together, in truth and grace." The congregation rose in applause, their faces filled with hope. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt whole.